Why would the risen Jesus look at the woman who loved him most, the very first person to see him alive, and speak 4 words that have puzzled believers for 2,000 years? Do not hold on. Was it rejection, or was it the deepest act of love ever spoken? It was still dark when Mary Magdalene walked toward the tomb, and grief walked with her every step of the way. She had not slept. Not for 1 night, not for 2. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the same thing again. The nails, the wood, the silence that came after. And the moment they took him down, and no one, not one single person, could do anything to stop it. For 3 days, she had carried a weight no words could describe. And now, before the sun had even touched the sky, she was going back to the only place left on earth where she could still feel close to him, his grave. She was not going there for a miracle. Understand that. She was not expecting anything. She was going to do the last thing love could still do. She was going to sit beside a sealed stone and say goodbye. But when she reached the tomb, her heart stopped. The stone was rolled away. For one terrible moment, she could not breathe. Her mind raced. Who had done this? Who would break into a grave? Wasn't it enough that they killed him? Now they had taken his body too. She did not walk closer. She turned and she ran. She ran through the dark streets, her feet barely touching the ground, one thought pounding in her chest over and over. They have taken him. They have taken my Lord, and I don't know where they have put him. She reached the house where the disciples were hiding, and she pounded on the door, and when it opened, she could barely get the words out. "They've taken him," she gasped. "The tomb is open. He's gone. Somebody took him, and I don't know where he is." Peter looked at John. John looked at Peter. And then both men were running. Now here is something most people never stop to notice. These were grown men, fishermen. Peter was strong-bold, the kind of man who spoke before he thought. And yet even he did not fully understand what was happening. Because when they got to the tomb and looked inside, they saw something that made no sense at all. The body was gone. But the burial cloths were still there. Think about that. If someone steals a body, they take the body. They don't unwrap it first. They don't fold the cloth and leave it behind. Grave robbers don't tidy up. Something about that scene was wrong, deeply wrong, and neither man could explain it. The scripture tells us that John looked and he believed. But believed what he didn't know yet. He only knew that whatever had happened here, it was not what any of them had feared. And so confused and shaken, Peter and John did the only thing they knew how to do. They went home. They left. But Mary stayed. And that one decision, the decision to stay when everyone else walked away, is where this entire story turns. Because Mary did not have the strength to leave. She had nothing left to run to. The 2 strongest men she knew had just seen the empty tomb and gone back to hide, and here she was, alone, standing outside a grave, weeping so hard that her whole body shook. She was not thinking about resurrection. She did not have theology in her mind. She had heartbreak. That is all. She simply could not bear to walk away from the last place she had felt him near. And then she bent down and looked into the tomb one more time. And this time she was not alone. 2 figures were there where the body had been, and they spoke to her, and they asked her one question. "Woman, why are you crying?" And please notice what she says. She does not scream. She does not fall down in fear. Her grief is so total that even the impossible cannot shake her out of it. She simply answers through her tears, "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him." She still thinks he is dead. She still thinks this is a robbery. She is standing at the doorway of the greatest miracle in human history, and she cannot see it because her eyes are so full of tears. And that right there is one of the most human moments in all of Scripture, because how many of us have stood exactly where Mary stood? How many of us have been so buried under our own pain that we could not see what God was already doing right in front of us? Then something made her turn around, and a man was standing there. She did not recognize him. Her eyes were swollen. The morning was dim, and grief has a way of blinding us to the very thing we are longing for. She thought he was the gardener, a worker, a stranger, and he asked her the same question. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" And Mary, still not understanding, still convinced she was talking to a laborer, pleaded with him. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." She was ready to carry a body herself. This grieving woman was offering to lift the weight of a grown man in her own arms just to bring him back to a proper grave. That is how much she loved him. And that is when it happened. The man said one word. Just one. Mary. And in that instant, everything changed. Because no stranger says your name like that. No gardener speaks to your soul. She had heard that voice call her name before, on the day her life was rescued, on the day her shame was lifted, on the day she stopped being who she used to be, and became who she was meant to be. She knew that voice. It was him. The man she had watched die was standing in front of her, alive, speaking her name. And her very first instinct, the most natural thing in the world, was to reach out and hold on to him, and never, ever let go. But before her hands could touch him, he said something that would confuse the world for 2,000 years. And in this video, we are going to uncover exactly what those words meant. Why the risen Christ spoke them to the very first person who ever saw him alive, and what this ancient moment in a garden is still trying to teach every one of us who has ever been asked to let go of something we loved. To understand why Jesus spoke those words, you have to understand who this woman was before that morning in the garden. Because Mary Magdalene was not chosen by accident. And the reason God let her be the very first to see the risen Christ, is a truth that turns everything we think about worthiness upside down. The world would not have picked her. She was not a priest. She was not a scholar of the law. She had never stood in a synagogue and taught. She held no title, no rank, no position that any man of her day would have respected. If you had asked the religious leaders of Jerusalem who deserved to carry the greatest news in the history of the world, not one of them would have said her name, because they remembered what she used to be. There was a time when Mary could not walk into a room without people turning away. There was a darkness in her, a torment so deep that Scripture tells us 7 demons had held her, and the people of her town had watched her suffer under it for years. They knew her by her worst days. They knew her by her shame. They had written her off the way people write off anyone whose brokenness is too public to hide. And then she met him. She never forgot the day he looked at her. Not with pity, not with disgust, but with something she had never seen in a human face before. He looked at her like she was worth saving. And in a single moment, everything that had chained her for years was gone. And for the first time in her life, Mary Magdalene was free. Do you understand now why she stayed at that tomb? Do you understand why she could not walk away when even Peter and John had gone home? Because she was not following a teacher. She was following the one who gave her back her life. When you have been that lost, and someone reaches into the pit and pulls you out, you do not stop loving him when the sky turns dark. You love him more. You follow him to the cross. You stand there while others run. You watch him die because you cannot bear to leave him alone in it, and then you show up at his grave before dawn because love does not check the time. That is the woman who was standing in the garden. And here is the twist that should stop every one of us cold. God knew exactly what the world thought of her. He knew her reputation. He knew her past. And he chose her anyway. He passed over the powerful and the respected and the religious, and he handed the greatest announcement ever spoken to a woman that everyone else had already given up on. Now sit with that for a moment. Because if you have ever believed that your past disqualifies you, if you have ever thought that God could use anyone but you, that you were too broken, too far gone, too stained by the things you have done, then Mary Magdalene is standing in that garden to tell you something. He does not choose the way people choose. He never has. But even she, even this woman of such fierce and faithful love, did not understand what was happening yet. Because when she came to that tomb, she did not come expecting resurrection. Let that sink in. She who had believed in him more than almost anyone did not walk to the grave thinking she would find him alive. She walked there to grieve. She came with spices, not with hope. In her mind, the story was over. The good man was dead, the world had won, and all that was left to do was to care for his body the way you care for anyone you have loved and lost. She went looking for a corpse. And that is one of the most overlooked truths in this entire account, and it matters more than you know, because the resurrection story does not begin with faith. It begins with grief. It does not begin with someone who had it all figured out. It begins with a broken woman doing the last small act of love she thought she had left. How many of us have been exactly there? We do not come to God on our strongest day. We come on the morning after the worst news of our lives. We come when the phone call has already destroyed us. We come when the marriage is already over, when the diagnosis is already spoken, when the person we could not live without is already gone. We do not come expecting miracles. We come because we do not know where else to go. And we come carrying grief in our hands, because it is the only thing we have left to carry. That was Mary. And so when she turned and saw him standing there and did not recognize him, do not judge her for it. She did not fail to see him because her love was weak. She failed to see him because her heart was shattered, and a shattered heart cannot imagine the very thing it wants most. She was so certain he was dead that even when he was standing 3 feet in front of her alive and speaking, her mind refused to accept it. She thought he was the gardener. She begged him to tell her where the body was. She, a grieving woman, offered to carry the full weight of a grown man's body in her own 2 arms just to bring him home. There is no calculation in that. There is only love that has stopped thinking about what is possible and only wants him back. And then he said her name. Mary. And in that instant the whole world cracked open, because the sound of your name in the mouth of the one who saved you is a sound you never forget. She had heard him say it before, on the day she was set free, and now she heard it again, and everything inside her that had died over those 3 days came roaring back to life. It was not a stranger. It was not the gardener. It was him, the one she watched die, the one she came to mourn, standing, breathing, alive. And she turned and cried out, "Rabboni, my teacher, my Lord," and she reached for him. Of course she reached for him. What else would she do? The one she thought was gone forever was standing right in front of her, and every fiber of her being wanted to grab hold of him and never let go again. She was not going to lose him twice. She had watched him die once, and no power on earth was going to pull her away from him now. She reached out to hold him the way you hold someone you were sure you would never touch again. And that is when Jesus, the risen Christ, the one she loved more than her own life, stopped her. He would not let her hold on, and the words he spoke in that moment have puzzled the faithful for 2,000 years because on the surface they sound almost cruel. Here is a woman who has done everything right. She followed him to the cross. She stayed when others fled. She came to his grave in the dark. She loved him when loving him cost everything. And now, at the very moment her joy returns, he tells her not to hold on to him. Why would he say that to her of all people at this moment of all moments? Was something wrong? Had she done something to push him away? Was her love, the very love that made her the first to see him suddenly, the thing he had to stop? No, it was none of that, because Jesus was not rejecting Mary. He was about to teach her the hardest and most beautiful lesson she would ever learn, the same lesson that God still whispers to every grieving heart that clings too tightly to what it is terrified to lose. And the meaning behind those words is not what almost anyone has ever assumed. For centuries, people read those words and heard something that was never there. Do not touch me. And on the surface, it sounds like a door closing. It sounds like rejection. It sounds like the risen Lord holding out his hand and telling the woman who loved him most to keep her distance. But that is not what he said. And once you understand what he really meant, this moment stops being a wound and becomes one of the most tender things Jesus ever spoke to a human being. The words in the original language do not mean "do not touch." They mean something far more specific and far more piercing. They mean, "Do not cling to me. Do not hold on. Do not grasp me and refuse to let go. Do you feel the difference? Because a touch is a greeting. A touch is a moment. But clinging is something else entirely. Clinging is what we do when we are afraid. Clinging is the grip of someone who has already lost once and cannot survive losing again. And that is exactly what Mary was doing. She was not reaching out to say hello. She was grabbing hold of him with everything she had because in her heart she was thinking, I am never letting you out of my sight again. I lost you once. I will die before I lose you twice. And Jesus, who understood her better than she understood herself, did not scold that. He honored it. But he also knew that her love, as fierce and beautiful as it was about to trap her in a moment that was never meant to last. Because here is the truth. Mary could not yet see. She wanted the old Jesus back. The teacher who walked the dusty roads beside her. The friend she could sit near in the evenings. The master whose voice she could hear and whose face she could see and whose hand she could hold. She wanted the relationship exactly the way it had been before the cross. She wanted to rewind 3 days and pretend the horror had never happened and go back to the way things were. And Jesus was telling her something that broke her heart even as it set her free. You cannot go back. Not because the past was bad, but because what is coming is greater than the past ever was. He was not returning to the way things used to be. He was rising into something entirely new. He had not come back from the dead to resume his old life. He had conquered death itself, and he was on his way to the Father. And the way Mary would know him from that day forward would not be a hand she could hold in a garden. It would be a presence that could live inside her everywhere, always in a way that no distance and no death could ever take from her again. And that is the twist that changes everything. Mary thought Jesus was asking her to accept less, to let go of him, to give something up. But Jesus was actually offering her more. He was telling her that the version of him she was clinging to, the one she could touch for a few minutes in a garden before the world pulled him away again, was nothing compared to the version of him she was about to receive, the one who would never leave her, who would be with her in every trial, every fear, every sleepless night, until the end of her days. But she could not have both. She could not cling to the old and receive the new at the same time. Her hands were full. And as long as her hands were wrapped around the Jesus, she used to know she had no room to receive the Jesus who was coming. And beloved, this is where his words stop being about a garden 2,000 years ago and start being about you. Because how many of us are standing exactly where Mary stood, gripping something with both hands, refusing to let go, terrified that if we open our fingers, we will lose the only thing we have left. We hold on to old seasons of life. We hold on to the way things were before everything changed. We hold on to a version of ourselves that no longer exists, to relationships that have already ended, to dreams that quietly died, to the memory of a person we would give anything to touch just one more time. And God in his mercy comes close and whispers the same thing he whispered to Mary in that garden. Do not cling. Not because it did not matter. It mattered. It mattered deeply. Jesus was not telling Mary that the years she walked beside him meant nothing. Of course they meant something. Those were the most precious years of her life. But he was telling her that if she held on to those years so tightly that she could not walk forward, she would miss the very thing he rose from the dead to give her. And that is the message every one of us needs to hear. There is a kind of holding on that honors the past. And there is a kind of holding on that imprisons us in it. There is remembering which heals, and there is clinging which slowly destroys, because it keeps us frozen at the mouth of an empty tomb, weeping over what is gone, when the living God is standing right behind us, saying our name, waiting for us to turn around. Think about what Jesus was actually asking of her. He was asking the impossible. He was asking a grieving woman in the first moment of her joy to loosen her grip on the one thing she wanted most in all the world. That is not a small thing. That is the hardest thing a human heart can ever be asked to do. And he asked it not to hurt her, but because he saw further down the road than she could. He saw who she was about to become. And he knew she could not become it with her hands clenched shut. Because a woman clinging to a garden cannot carry a message to the world. That is the breakthrough hidden inside those difficult words. Jesus was not ending his relationship with Mary. He was elevating it. He was taking her from someone who followed him to someone who would proclaim him. He was taking her from a disciple who sat at his feet to an apostle who would stand before others and declare that death had been defeated. But she could not step into that calling while she was still holding on to the smaller thing. And so it comes down to a single unbearable question, the same question that hangs over every grieving heart that has ever stood outside its own empty tomb. Will you keep holding on to what was? Or will you open your hands and trust what is coming? Because Mary had to decide right there in that garden in the span of a single heartbeat. She could argue, she could refuse, she could throw her arms around him and weep and beg him never to leave and cling to the only comfort she had left. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to do exactly that. Or she could do the hardest and bravest thing love has ever been asked to do. She could let go. And what she chose in that moment, and what happened the instant she opened her hands, is the reason we still tell her story 2,000 years later. She let go. We are not told exactly what it cost her to open those hands, but every one of us who has ever had to release something we loved knows the weight of that moment. Somewhere inside, Mary made a decision that went against every instinct she had. She stopped clinging. She stepped back. And in doing so, she trusted him with a faith deeper than the faith it took to follow him to the cross. And the instant her hands were empty, Jesus gave her something to fill them. He gave her a mission. Go, he told her. Go to my brothers and tell them. Stop and let the weight of that land on you. Because a moment ago, she was the woman who came to grieve. A moment ago, she was the woman gripping him so she would not lose him twice. And now, in the space of a single breath, the risen Christ turned to her and made her the first messenger of the greatest news the world had ever heard. Not Peter, not John, not one of the men who had walked with him for 3 years. Her, the woman the world had written off, the one they remembered by her worst days, the one who had been so broken that 7 demons once held her captive. She was the one Jesus chose to carry the announcement that would split human history in two. And here is the twist that should take your breath away. Jesus could have appeared to anyone first. He could have risen and walked straight into the temple and confronted the very men who condemned him. He could have appeared to Pilate. He could have stood before the crowd that screamed for his death. He had every right to make his return an act of overwhelming power that no one could deny. Instead, he chose a weeping woman in a garden. He chose the least likely person in the entire story. And he did it on purpose. Because from the very first moment of the resurrection, Jesus was making something unmistakably clear. This news was not going to belong to the powerful. It was not going to be locked away with the important and the respected. It was going to be carried by the broken, the overlooked, the ones the world had already given up on. The gospel would not travel down from the top. It would rise up from the bottom, from a woman with a past running through the streets, with tears still on her face, and joy exploding out of her chest. And run she did. She turned from that garden, and she ran the same streets she had run before dawn. But everything was different now. She had come those streets in the dark, carrying grief. She went back through them in the light, carrying life. The same feet that stumbled toward a grave now flew toward the future. And when she reached the room where the disciples sat, huddled in their fear and their grief, convinced that everything was over, she burst through with 4 words that turned the world upside down. I have seen the Lord. Think about what those men were feeling in that room. They were shattered. They had watched their teacher die. They had scattered like frightened children. Peter was drowning in the shame of having denied him 3 times. They had locked the doors because they were terrified they would be next. As far as they were concerned, the dream was dead and buried behind a stone. And then the door flew open, and there stood Mary, breathless and radiant, saying the impossible. I have seen him. He is alive. I have seen the Lord. Those were simple words. A child could speak them. But they were the first proclamation of the resurrection ever spoken by human lips, and they came out of the mouth of a woman, that no religious leader of her day would have trusted to teach anything. That is the God we serve. And now at last we can answer the question we asked at the very beginning. Why did Jesus tell the woman who loved him most not to hold on to him? Was it rejection? Was something wrong with her faith? Was he pushing her away? No, it was the opposite of rejection. It was the highest form of love. Because Jesus did not tell her to let go so he could leave her. He told her to let go so he could send her. He did not stop her from clinging because he wanted her further from him. He stopped her because he wanted to trust her with something far greater than a moment in a garden. If Mary had held on, she would have stayed. If she had clung, she would have missed her calling. If she had gotten the thing she wanted most, that quiet, private, unchanging closeness in the garden, the world might never have heard the news that morning. Her grief would have kept her, and her clinging would have imprisoned her, and the greatest message in history would have died on her lips before it was ever spoken. But because she let go, she became the first voice of hope the world ever heard. Do you see it now? The thing she thought was a loss was actually a promotion. The moment she feared was an ending was the beginning of everything. Jesus did not take something away from Mary that morning. He gave her a purpose that would outlive her by 2,000 years. And this is where her story stops being ancient history and becomes your story too. Because right now, someone is standing outside their own empty tomb. Someone is gripping the past with both hands, weeping over what is gone, terrified to open their fingers. Someone is holding on to a season that has already ended, a person who is no longer here, a version of their life that will never come back. And God is standing behind them, close enough to touch, whispering the same word he whispered to Mary. Turn around. Let go. Not because what you lost did not matter. It mattered. But because you were made for more than the grave you are weeping beside. You were made to carry something forward. And you cannot do it with your hands clenched shut around what is already gone. The woman who came to say goodbye became the woman who announced that death itself had been defeated. The one who arrived with spices for a corpse left as the first witness to eternal life. And it all turned on a single impossible act of trust, the moment she stopped holding on to what was and opened her hands to what was coming. That is the answer Jesus gave her in the garden, and it is the same answer he is offering right now to every heart that has ever been asked to let go. And that answer is not only about resurrection. If you stop at the empty tomb, you have only heard half of what happened in that garden. Because the deepest miracle that morning was not that a dead man walked out of a grave. The deepest miracle was what happened inside a broken woman when she finally let go. She arrived searching for a goodbye. She left carrying a mission. She came believing the story was over. She left knowing it had only just begun. And nothing about her changed on the outside. She was the same woman with the same past and the same face the world had judged for years. But something inside her had been utterly transformed, and it happened the moment she chose to open her hands. That is the truth so many people miss. They think resurrection is only about the body of Jesus rising. But the resurrection was never meant to stay in that garden. It was meant to rise up inside every person who has ever felt dead on the inside, every heart that has been buried under grief, every soul that has stood at the mouth of a tomb, convinced that nothing good could ever come again. Because here is the twist that reaches across 2,000 years and lands right in the middle of your life. The words Jesus spoke to Mary were never a rejection. They were an invitation. When he said, "Do not cling to me," he was not slamming a door. He was opening one. He was saying, "Do not settle for holding my hand for a few minutes in a garden when I am about to become the one who never leaves your side again." And that same invitation is being spoken over you right now, because so many people are holding on to things that are quietly keeping them from moving forward. They are holding on to the pain of what someone did to them years ago. They are holding on to the regret of a decision they cannot undo. They are holding on to fear, to bitterness, to the version of life they were so sure they were going to have. They are gripping it all with both hands, and they wonder why they feel stuck, why the joy never comes, why they keep standing outside the same tomb weeping over the same loss year after year. And the answer is the same answer Jesus gave Mary. You cannot receive what God wants to place in your hands while your hands are still clenched around what is already gone. Sometimes God asks you to release what you are holding, not because He wants to leave you empty, but because He cannot fill hands that refuse to open. Mary had to let go of the Jesus she could see before she could receive the Jesus who would never leave. And you may have to let go of what was before you can take hold of what is coming. That empty tomb was never a symbol of loss. Think about that. The world looked at that opened grave and saw a robbery, a tragedy, one more cruel blow. Peter and John looked inside and were confused. Mary looked and wept. But that emptiness was not proof that something had been taken. It was proof that death itself had been defeated. The very thing that looked like the end was the loudest announcement of victory the universe has ever heard. And that is what God does with the empty places in your life. The chapter that ended, the dream that died, the relationship that is gone, the part of yourself you buried a long time ago. You look at those empty places and you see loss. But God is standing in the middle of them, and He is telling you the same thing the angels told Mary. Why are you weeping here? The one you are looking for is not in the grave. He is alive, and He is standing right behind you, and He is calling your name. Because the greatest lesson of that morning is not that we always get back what we lost. Mary did not get the old life back. She did not return to those quiet days walking the roads beside her teacher. That season was over, and it was never coming back. And yet what she received was greater than anything she gave up. She traded a hand she could hold for a presence that would carry her the rest of her days. She traded the past she was clinging to for a purpose that would outlive every empire on earth. That is the trade God is offering you. And it comes down to the same question Mary faced in that garden, the question that still hangs over every grieving heart that has ever been asked to let go. Will you keep holding on to what was, or will you trust what is coming next? Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding what you lost. Sometimes the greatest miracle is discovering who you become after you finally let go. Mary Magdalene walked into that garden as a woman defined by her past, remembered for her worst days, written off by everyone who thought they knew her. She walked out as the first person in human history to proclaim that the grave was empty and death was beaten. And the only thing that stood between those two women, the one who came weeping and the one who ran rejoicing, was a single moment when she chose to open her hands. So hear this, wherever you are, whatever tomb you have been standing beside. The stone has already been rolled away. The grave is already empty. And the same voice that called Mary by name in the garden is calling you by name right now, asking you to stop weeping over what is gone and turn around and see what He is offering you instead. You do not have to stay at the tomb. You do not have to keep clinging to the past. You were not made to spend your life grieving beside a grave that God has already emptied. You were made to be transformed. You were made to carry hope. You were made for the life that begins the moment you finally let go. Mary let go. And the whole world heard her say 4 words that have echoed for 2,000 years and will echo until the end of time. I have seen the Lord. He is not in the grave. He is not in the past you are clinging to. He is risen. He is alive. And He is calling your name. Let go and go tell the others.